The first roof beam cracked just after midnight. Snow came sideways that night, the kind that does not fall so much as attack, and every rancher within 20 miles of Pine Ridge knew before they banked their fires that the Mercer homestead would not see morning standing. The old house had been groaning for 2 winters already, the way a tired animal groans before it goes down for the last time. Levi Boone stood in his own yard in the dark, not moving, listening to that groan carry across the field like something being asked to give up. Then he saw her. A woman stood on the roof ridge above him, wool coat soaked through, a lantern lashed to her belt swinging wild in the wind. She was hammering, not frantic, steady, the way a person works when they have already decided the wind does not get a vote. She was taller than any man in the valley, taller than the doorframe she must have ducked through to get up there, and she drove nails into a failing beam like the storm was simply someone she had agreed to outwork. By first light, the house was still standing. Every family in that valley would talk about that night for years afterward. But for a long while, they would tell it as a joke about the size of the bride nobody had asked for, rather than the truth of what she had actually saved. If you have ever done the work that kept everyone else's world from falling down, and watched them remember the wrong part of the story anyway, you already know why this one is going to matter to you. Stay through to the end of this one. Subscribe if these frontier stories are the ones that get you, and tell me in the comments what town you are watching from tonight. 3 months earlier, Levi Boone had not been thinking about roofs at all. He had been thinking about the letter from the bank, folded into quarters in his coat pocket, the one that used the word foreclosure twice in 4 sentences, as if once might not be believed. His wife had been gone 2 winters. Fever, the kind that came fast and did not negotiate. He had buried her in the plot behind the house his own father built, and he had gone on running the ranch alone the way a man does when grief is a chore he has not gotten around to yet. The herd had thinned. The barn roof had started to sag on the north side, and the note his father had taken out years back, the one Levi had always assumed would simply age itself into nothing, had instead grown teeth. He still kept Sarah's boots by the back door, unmoved, one fallen slightly against the other the way she'd left them the last morning she was well enough to stand in them. He told himself it was practical, that the boots still fit a task he might need them for. He had not once, in 2 years, found a task that required a dead woman's boots. He simply had not been able to make his hands pick them up and put them somewhere else, because putting them somewhere else meant admitting she was not coming back down that hall to step into them again. He did not tell anyone, because there was no good way to say it plainly, that some nights he sat at his father's old desk with the ledger open in front of him and did not see numbers at all. He saw his father's hands, steady on that same desk 30 years back, building something out of raw ground that had never once come apart in his father's lifetime. Levi had inherited it whole. He was watching it come apart now in his own 2 hands, and some nights the grief for Sarah and the shame of the failing ranch tangled together so completely he could not have told a stranger which one kept him staring at the ceiling until past 2 in the morning. A wife meant hands. A wife meant someone to keep the house from falling in on itself while he fought the land back into shape. That was the whole of his thinking when he placed the advertisement in the territorial paper. Rancher, 34, seeks practical wife. Must be capable of hard work and plain living. No romantic notions required. He had expected someone quiet. Someone small enough to fit easily into a life already half collapsed. Someone who would not ask too many questions about a house with holes in its foundation and a debt with a deadline. Instead, the stage from the territorial line let down a woman who stood nearly a foot over Levi's own 6 feet, broad through the shoulder in a way that made the wagon step groan when she came down it, carrying her own trunk under one arm like it weighed nothing, and a canvas roll of carpenter's tools slung over the other. The whole of Pine Ridge had turned out to watch the wedding that never quite happened on schedule, because half the town had gathered outside the church first, just to see her. Levi heard the laughter before he saw her face clearly. He heard it again after. He did not laugh. He was too busy noticing that her eyes, when they finally found his across the churchyard, did not carry the apology he expected. They carried something more like a question, as if she was the one deciding whether he would do. Her name was Clara Whitlock. She said it plainly, the way a person states a fact rather than offers an introduction, and she did not extend her hand until he extended his first. They rode out to the homestead in near silence, the wind picking up ahead of a storm that had not yet decided how bad it meant to be. Levi found himself glancing sideways more than once, trying to reconcile the size of her against the size of the woman he had imagined answering that advertisement, and failing every time. She did not seem to notice him looking, or she noticed, and had long since stopped minding. When the house came into view, sagging roofline and all, she asked him to stop the wagon. She did not go inside. Not that day. Instead, Clara climbed down, walked the full perimeter of the house once, slow, running one gloved hand along the foundation stones as she went. Then she walked it again. Levi stood by the wagon and watched her circle his home a third time, and something in him that had been braced for a quiet, agreeable stranger began, very slightly, to recalculate. "Well," he said, when she finally stopped. "Your foundation is failing on the northeast corner," Clara said. "If I sleep inside tonight, I would like to know in advance which wall intends to kill me first." Levi opened his mouth to tell her the house had stood for 11 years and would stand a good while longer. He closed it again. He had seen the way she pressed her palm flat against the stone before she said it, the way she waited, listening for something he could not hear himself. She was not guessing. He understood that plainly, and it unsettled him more than her height had. That first week, Clara gave orders the way other men gave weather reports, flat, certain, expecting no argument because none seemed necessary. On the third morning, she told him to clear every sack of feed out of the east shed before noon. "That shed's held feed through 6 winters, Levi said. "Not through this one," she said, and did not repeat herself. He moved the feed because arguing with her took more energy than moving grain sacks did, and because some part of him, the part that had watched her read his failing house like a page of scripture, wanted to see if she was right. 3 hours later, the east shed roof came down under the weight of wet snow, folding in on itself with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Levi stood in the yard looking at the wreckage a long while. Clara did not look particularly surprised. By the following Sunday, half of Pine Ridge had heard some version of the story, and the story had already begun to grow a second head. The giant bride, who could hear a house dying before it knew it itself, told with a laugh, mostly. But laughter, Levi noticed, that had gone a shade thinner than it had been outside the church. The storm that took the neighbor's boy came without warning, the way the worst ones always did in that country. Young Sam Griggs had wandered off from his family's spread chasing a dog that had bolted after something in the tree line, and by the time his mother noticed him gone, the snow had already erased his tracks. Word reached the Boone place by way of a half-frozen rider just past dusk, and within the hour half the valley was out in the dark with lanterns, calling a name the wind kept snatching away before it traveled far. Clara did not call his name. She walked the fence line slow, head down, reading the drift patterns the way she had read Levi's foundation that first day. She stopped near an old root cellar nobody had used in years, half collapsed and mostly forgotten, and studied the way the snow had piled against its door. "Fresh drift," she said, banked wrong for the wind direction. Something had disturbed it recently enough that the storm hadn't smoothed it over yet. She dug through packed snow and a door frozen half shut with her bare hands, tearing 2 fingernails down to the quick doing it, until she got it open enough to fit her arm through and pull the boy out, blue-lipped and shaking but breathing. Nobody laughed at the wedding joke that night. Nobody said much of anything at all, but Levi watched the way the men who had gathered outside his house that evening looked at Clara afterward, and it was not the same look they had carried into his yard. Later, once the boy had been carried home wrapped in every coat the search party could spare, Levi found Clara sitting alone on the porch steps, her torn hands wrapped in a strip of cloth she had not asked him to help with. "You didn't call out for him," Levi said. "The whole search party was hollering his name. You just walked the fence line quiet." "Folks who are lost and scared don't always come toward the noise," Clara said. "Sometimes noise is the thing that put them in trouble to begin with. I figured the snow would tell me more than shouting would." He sat down near her, not too close, the way a man does when he has not yet earned the right to closer. "You've done that kind of reading before. The house. Now this." She was quiet a moment. "I was engaged 3 times before I came out on that stage," she said finally. 3 men. Good men, near as I could tell. None of them ever once told me I was too much of anything. What happened then? Their families did the telling for them, she said. A mother who couldn't picture grandchildren she'd have to explain. A father worried what the neighbors would say about a daughter-in-law folks would stare at in church. Each time it ended the same way. Not because the man stopped wanting me, but because he stopped being willing to spend the rest of his life defending the wanting. Levi did not say anything for a while. He had spent 3 days assuming the size of her was the whole of what people saw when they looked at Clara Whitlock. It had not occurred to him, until just then, that she had spent considerably longer than 3 days learning exactly how that assumption felt from the other side of it. "I'm not looking to be defended," Clara added, before he could offer anything that might have sounded like it. "I'm looking to be useful enough that the question never comes up." Levi was quiet a moment, turning that over. Then, because something about the dark and the cold and the boy sleeping safe 2 houses over made it easier to say than it would have been in daylight, he said, "My father built this ranch out of nothing. Buried 2 brothers doing it, and a wife, and never once let me see him falter. I've spent 2 years since Sarah died feeling like the first boon to finally lose the thread of it. Like the failings got my name on it now, and everyone in this valley is just waiting to see how bad it gets before they say so to my face." Clara looked at him then, the way she had at the churchyard, without pity and without the polite sliding away of eyes he'd half expected from a stranger. "That's a different kind of being watched," she said. "But it's the same fear underneath. Waiting for the moment somebody finally says out loud what you've already decided about yourself." Neither of them said anything else for a while, but it was Levi who had spoken first this time, and something in that cost him, and something in that cost eased a weight he had not told another living soul about since the funeral. Levi thought about that long after she had gone inside. He thought it was possibly the loneliest sentence he had heard a person say in some while, delivered so plainly that she likely hadn't noticed how it sounded. The debt ledger went missing 4 days later. Levi kept it in the top drawer of his father's old desk, the one record that mattered more than any other, the one that told him exactly how many weeks remained before the bank's patience ran out entirely. He went to check the date on a payment and found the drawer standing open, the ledger simply gone. There had been no broken window, no forced door. The house had been empty only twice that week, both times for less than an hour, and nothing else had been touched. Not the strongbox, not his father's pocket watch, not anything a common thief might have reasonably wanted. "Someone wanted to know exactly what we know," Clara said, when he told her, "or wanted to make sure we couldn't prove what we knew. Come time to argue it in front of a judge." Levi had no answer for that. He had lived in that house his whole life without once considering that somebody might walk through it uninvited and know precisely what to take. It was Clara who found the crawl space, a week after that, while she was on her knees prying up warped floorboards in the kitchen to get at a joist she didn't trust. Beneath the boards, tucked into a gap no wider than a bread box, she found a tin box that had clearly been hidden there a long while. Old receipts gone soft with damp, a set of survey maps folded so many times the creases had nearly worn through, and a handful of notes in handwriting Levi recognized immediately as his father's. "Somebody surveyed this land years back," Clara said, spreading the papers carefully across the table. "Look here, there's markings on the ridge line your father never mentioned to you, near as I can tell. And this note, it's dated the same season your father took out that loan." Levi frowned over the old, cramped handwriting. Most of it was ordinary business, feed costs, a dispute over a fence line with a neighbor long since moved on. But one line, near the bottom of a page gone brittle at the edges, caught him. "Men back up on the north ridge again, walking it slow with their instruments same as before. 3rd time this year they've come asking after ground that isn't theirs to ask after. Told them plain there's nothing up there worth their trouble. Don't think they believed me any better this time than the last 2. I don't remember any surveyors," Levi said slowly. "My father never mentioned this to me." "Maybe he didn't think it mattered," Clara said. "Or maybe he thought he'd already said no clearly enough that it was settled." She looked at the note a long moment, something careful moving behind her eyes. Either way, somebody wanted something up on that ridge badly enough to keep coming back after being told no twice already. Man doesn't do that over ground with nothing on it. Neither of them had the shape of it yet, not fully. But something in the quiet after she said it made Levi feel, for the first time since the ledger disappeared, that the trouble on his ranch had never been simple bad luck to begin with. Clara was already at the barn stove when Levi came out the next morning, well before the sky had decided on its color yet. She had found an old tin cup in the tack room, dented on one side, the enamel chipped through to bare metal near the rim, and had taken to using it for the coffee she made before first light, before either of them had reason to be awake. Levi did not know why that particular cup, out of every cup in the house. He never asked. Some things a person picks for reasons that are theirs alone to know. He sat down on the overturned crate across from her without a word. She poured a second cup, not the chipped one, that one stayed hers, and handed it across without looking up from the fire. The horses shifted in their stalls behind them, that low, settling sound animals make in the last dark before a working day begins. Steam came off both cups, and neither of them spoke for a long while. And it was not the strained kind of quiet Levi had grown used to during his first week of marriage to a stranger. It was the other kind. The kind two people can sit inside together without needing to fill it up with anything. Clara held her cup in both hands, not drinking, just letting the warmth sit against her palms. Levi watched the fire find the cracks in a log and widen them, slow, patient, the only thing moving in the whole barn besides their breath. A long while passed like that, long enough that when he finally spoke, his own voice startled him a little, coming into a quiet that deep. "Clara," he said, using her name plain, the way he hadn't quite let himself before. She did not look up right away. A beat passed, then another, her thumb moving once along the rim of the cup before she lifted her eyes to his. "You don't have to prove your worth here," Levi said. "Not to me. I've seen enough these 2 weeks to know it plain." She did not answer. Not right away. She looked back down at the cup in her hands, and the fire popped once, and the silence that followed his sentence stretched long enough that Levi began to wonder if he'd said something wrong, said too much, reached for something that wasn't his to reach for yet. Then, slowly, something in her jaw eased, so small a change he might have missed it if he hadn't already learned to watch her that closely. The particular easing of a person who has spent a long while braced for a different sentence than the one they just heard. She did not take her coat off that morning, but she stopped wearing it inside the house after that day, the way a person stops carrying an umbrella once they've finally trusted the weather to hold. Levi noticed. He did not say anything about it either. Some things, he was learning, a person lets stand on their own without narrating them to death. They talked instead about ordinary matters. Which fence posts needed replacing before the ground froze solid. Whether the roan mare was carrying a foal or simply putting on winter weight. Small things. Practical things. But Levi found himself listening to the sound of her voice in the gray morning, quiet the way he used to listen to weather coming in off the ridge, for what it might mean, for what was underneath it. Before he rode out to check the herd that morning, he set his empty cup down beside hers on the stove ledge, side by side, and neither one of them moved to separate them again for the rest of that winter. That became the shape of most mornings after. Levi found himself waking earlier than the work required, simply to be at the stove before the sky lightened, and he noticed, without remarking on it, that Clara had begun doing the same. Neither of them called it anything. They talked about fence posts and foaling mares and the price of feed, and underneath all of it ran something neither one was yet prepared to name, quiet and steady as the coffee steamed between them. One morning, close on 2 weeks into the habit, Clara set the chipped cup down and said, without any particular weight to it, "My mother used to say a house isn't a home until 2 people have argued in the kitchen and made their peace in it before breakfast." "We haven't argued yet," Levi said. "No," Clara agreed. "We haven't." She looked at him a moment longer than the sentence required. "Give it time." He laughed, short and surprised out of him, the first real laugh Clara had heard from him since she'd arrived. She did not laugh back, but something eased at the corner of her mouth that had not eased there before, and Levi found he was already looking forward to the next morning before this one had even finished. It was near a month into the habit before Clara told him about the cup. "It isn't mine," she said one morning, turning it slow between her hands rather than drinking from it right away. "Found it packed at the bottom of my trunk after the second engagement ended. My mother pressed it on me when I first left home. Said a woman ought to carry one thing that's hers alone, something nobody can take back from her no matter how a household gets divided up. I never told either of the other 2 men about it. Didn't see the use, seeing as neither arrangement was built to last." "Why tell me then?" Levi asked. Clara considered that a moment, watching the fire. "Because you set your cup down next to mine every morning without asking permission first, and never once acted like the space beside it was owed to you." She looked up. "That's rarer than you'd think." Levi did not answer right away. He turned his own cup slow in his hands, watching the steam thin and rise, and the quiet stretched long enough that a horse shifted its weight somewhere behind them. And still he did not speak, and Clara did not press him to. Sarah used to hum while she cooked, he said finally. Old hymns, mostly, tuneless as anything, and I used to complain about it just to hear her laugh at me for complaining. I haven't been able to stand a quiet kitchen since she passed. Didn't understand why until just now, sitting here with you, that it wasn't the humming I missed exactly. It was somebody else's sound filling up a house I'd started to think only had room for mine. Clara did not offer him comfort for that, and he was grateful for it, because comfort just then would have felt like being handled. She only nodded, once, the way she nodded at a foundation stone she'd decided would hold, and let the silence that followed carry the rest of what neither of them had the words for yet. Money came first, dressed up as kindness. The banker came out to the ranch himself, which Levi noted was unusual enough on its own to warrant suspicion before the man had said a single word. Silas Doyle ran the only bank within 30 miles of Pine Ridge, a soft-spoken man who dressed a shade too well for a territory this far from anywhere fashionable, and he sat in Levi's kitchen with his hat in his lap and offered, without being asked, to extend the note another full season. No penalty, no change in terms. Simply a kindness, he said, from one neighbor to another, in light of the hardship of a missing ledger and a collapsed shed and all the trouble this poor family had weathered lately. That's generous of you, Levi said, because it was the expected thing to say, though something in his chest had already gone tight and watchful. Clara said nothing at all until Doyle had ridden off down the lane. Then she set down the cloth she'd been drying dishes with and looked at Levi steady. Don't sign anything he sends you, she said. He's offering us more time, Clara. That's the one thing standing between us and losing this place. A man doesn't become kind the day after he learns your papers went missing, Clara said. Not unless he already knew they were missing before you told him. I'd want to know how he heard, before I sign my name to anything he's holding out. Levi turned that over a long while after she'd gone back to her work, and found he did not have a good answer for how the banker could have known about the ledger at all, unless somebody had told him. And the only people who knew were the two of them, and whoever had taken it from the drawer in the first place. Then came the old cruelty, finally given a name. The dressmaker came to the house 3 days later, unannounced, her eyes red-rimmed before she'd even gotten down off her wagon. Mrs. Aldous had been the one, months back, who refused to sew Clara's wedding dress at all, claiming a backlog of orders that never seemed to trouble her enough to turn away any other bride in the valley. Clara had worn a dress borrowed from a neighbor instead, taken in badly at the shoulders, and had said nothing about it since. I have to tell you something I should have said the day it happened, Mrs. Aldous said, standing in the yard, twisting her gloves in her hands. 3 of the ranch wives came to my shop before your wedding. Told me plain they'd take their business elsewhere, all of them, permanent, if I made a dress for a woman built the way you're built. Said it wouldn't look right in the church. Said folks would talk. Clara stood very still. I needed that trade to keep my shop open, Mrs. Aldous went on, voice cracking. I told myself it was just business. It wasn't. It was cruelty, and I let it wear the coat of business so I wouldn't have to look at it plain. I'm sorry. I've been carrying that a long while. Clara did not say it was all right, because it was not, and she had never been a woman inclined to say a thing she didn't mean simply to ease another person's conscience. But she thanked Mrs. Aldous for coming to say it, and something in the set of her shoulders that evening carried a weight it hadn't carried the day before. Not heavier, Levi thought, watching her from the porch. Different. The particular relief of finally having names to put to an old, formless hurt. Then the danger stopped being a matter of paper and pride, and turned to fire. The haystack went up 9 nights later, orange against a sky already thick with snow, and every man on the place turned out to fight it before it could jump to the barn. They saved the barn. They did not save the hay, 3 months of feed gone to ash and steam in under an hour. And the following morning half of Pine Ridge was already calling it bad luck, a stray spark carried on the wind, the kind of thing that simply happened in a hard winter. Clara knelt in the trampled, blackened snow at first light, working through the wreckage with the same slow attention she'd given Levi's failing foundation the day she arrived. She came up holding a scrap of charred lantern wick between 2 fingers, and held it out to him without a word. It smelled of coal oil. Too much coal oil, soaked through in a way no ordinary lantern accident left behind. Lightning doesn't leave a wick behind for us to find, Clara said. Somebody set this fire and wanted it to look like weather. Levi rode into town that same afternoon to report it, and came back with less than he'd hoped for. The sheriff had listened with his boots up on the corner of his desk and told him, not unkindly, that a man in his position might do well to consider selling before worse than a haystack went up in flames. No mention of an investigation. Just the same tired suggestion Doyle's kindness had already tried to plant. Levi noticed one thing on his way out the door that he mentioned to Clara that evening. A new silver watch chain looped across the sheriff's vest, bright enough it hadn't seen a season's wear yet. That watch bears a mark, Clara said, when he described it. Same mark as the bank's letterhead. I'd wager good money it wasn't bought on a sheriff's salary. Levi sat with that a long while, the pieces of it beginning, slowly and unwillingly, to arrange themselves into a shape he did not want to look at directly yet. A banker, a sheriff, a fire dressed up as weather, all of it circling the same ground his father had once refused 3 men with instruments walking his north ridge. The great storm came at the tail end of that same month, worse than anything the valley had seen in a decade, and it took 3 neighboring barns down flat before the night was through. The Boone homestead stood. Every beam Clara had reinforced, every joist she'd distrusted enough to replace, every foundation stone she'd reset with her own hands held through wind that peeled roofs off houses built by men who'd lived in this country their whole lives. By morning, half a dozen families had made their way through the drifts to the one house in the valley still standing whole, carrying children wrapped against the cold, asking, for the first time since Clara Whitlock had come down off that stage, not what was wrong with a woman built the way she was, but whether there was room enough by the fire for one more. There was. Clara made certain there was, moving through her own crowded kitchen with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything else. And Levi stood in the doorway watching his home fill up with people who had laughed at his wedding, and felt something in his chest that he did not yet have adequate words for. It was young Sam Griggs's mother who said it plainest, sometime past midnight. Watching Clara settle a half-dozen borrowed children to sleep along the kitchen floor with quilts she'd been piecing together all winter for exactly no occasion in particular, as though some part of her had always known a night like this one was coming. "We had you figured wrong," Mrs. Griggs said quietly, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "The whole valley did. I'm sorry it took a night like this for most of us to say so out loud." Clara did not answer with forgiveness, not yet, and not with bitterness either. She only nodded once, plain, and went on tucking a quilt corner under a sleeping child's chin, and Levi understood, watching her, that being seen correctly after months of being seen wrong was not the kind of thing that mended itself in a single grateful sentence. It would take longer than one storm, but it had, at least, finally begun. The contractor arrived in the first thaw of fall spring, passing through on his way to survey a rail spur 2 counties over, and he stopped his wagon dead in the lane when he caught sight of the reinforced roofline Clara had reworked over the winter. "That truss pattern," he said, climbing down without introducing himself first. "Where in God's name did a Montana ranch come by that truss pattern?" "I built it," Clara said. The man, whose name turned out to be Holloway, looked at her a long moment the way a person looks at something they have been trying to place for years and finally can. "You're her," he said. "Whitlock. You did the drafting for the Cordray building, back east. 81, 82. I worked the crew that raised it. Foreman told us the plans came down from head office. Nobody ever said a woman's name was on them. It wasn't, by the time they printed the final set," Clara said, and there was nothing bitter in the way she said it. Only a plainness that Levi had come to recognize as costing her considerably more than bitterness would have. "My name came off. The plans didn't." Holloway had the decency to look ashamed on behalf of men he'd likely never met. He didn't stay long after that, but he left Levi with a clearer understanding of something that had been sitting half-formed in him for weeks, that everything Clara did with such unhurried certainty, the foundations, the roof trusses, the way she read a failing structure like a page of print, none of it was instinct alone. It was a gift the world had already tried once to take credit for and erase. And she had rebuilt her whole life anyway, twice now, without once being asked what that cost her. Levi made his mistake 3 days after that, and he made it. as men in that particular kind of trouble usually do, believing entirely that he was protecting the person he was actually about to wound. He rode into town alone, without telling Clara where he was going, and sat across from the banker's desk and agreed, in principle, to sell the ranch once the worst of winter had passed. Better a smaller, honest loss now, he told himself, than watching Clara run herself into the ground fighting for land that might already be lost regardless of how many roofs she reinforced. He told himself it was mercy. He signed his name to a preliminary agreement and rode home believing he had done the hard, responsible thing a husband does when he cannot bring himself to watch his wife exhaust herself for nothing. Clara found the folded paper in his coat that same evening, doing nothing more than what she always did, mending a torn seam before it worsened. She read it standing by the stove, and she did not shout. She did not throw anything, or weep, or ask him to explain himself in the raised voice a lesser scene might have called for. She simply folded the paper back along its original creases and set it on the table between them, very precisely, the way a person sets down something they no longer intend to argue about. "You didn't ask me," she said. "I was trying to spare you a fight we might not win." "That's not why you didn't ask me," Clara said, and her voice, when it came, was steady in the particular way that costs more than shouting ever does. "You didn't ask me because some part of you still believes what everybody in this valley believed the day I stepped off that stage, that I'm someone to be managed around, decided for, protected from my own choices, like a child or an animal that might hurt itself if left to its own judgment. Clara, that isn't. I have spent my whole life being decided about," she said, "by families who couldn't picture me in their photographs, by a company that printed my drawings under another man's name. I came out here believing, for the first time and longer than I can rightly measure, that I'd found a place where I got a vote in my own life. And now I find out you signed away the one thing we've built together without so much as asking what I thought." She went to the back room that night and packed her tools into the same canvas roll she'd arrived with, precise and unhurried, the way she did everything. She did not slam the door on her way out to the bunkhouse. Levi almost wished she had. The quiet was worse. He lay awake a long while that night, staring at a ceiling she had reinforced with her own hands 3 months back, and understood, too late to matter, exactly what he had actually broken. She did not leave in the morning. Levi found her instead at first light, back at the kitchen table, the tin box from the crawl space open in front of her again, his father's old survey maps spread flat beneath both her hands. "I'm not staying because you apologized," she said, before he could say anything at all. "I haven't decided yet whether I've forgiven you for not asking. I'm staying because I found something last night I think you need to see, and I'm not in the habit of walking away from a fight partway through, even a fight I'm currently furious at you about." She turned one of the survey maps toward him and tapped a section of the North Ridge, the same ground his father's old note had mentioned, the surveyors who'd come asking 3 times in one season. "This isn't cattle land they've been after," Clara said. "Look at these markings. Gravel deposit, and a good one, running the length of this ridge. The kind railroad companies pay a fortune for, laying track through this territory the way they've been talking about doing for years. Your father's note wasn't about mineral rights in the abstract. Somebody already knew exactly what sat under this ground, and they've been trying to get their hands on it since before you were old enough to run this place yourself." Levi stared at the old, careful markings a long while. "The bank never wanted the cattle," he said slowly. "It never wanted the debt paid off quiet and easy. It wanted the land itself. And a scared, grieving widower with a failing roof and a wife nobody thought would last the winter," Clara said, "was exactly the kind of owner they figured wouldn't look too close at why he was suddenly so unlucky." Neither of them said the rest of it aloud, not yet. But Levi understood, looking at her hands steady on the old maps, that the woman across the table from him had just handed him back a reason to fight for his own land that had nothing to do with whether she'd forgiven him, and everything to do with a debt neither one of them intended to let go unpaid. The spring thaw came early and came hard, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary swelling past its banks faster than anyone in the valley had planned for, and Levi rode out at first light to warn the families downstream before the water reached them. He did not see the current take the ground out from under his horse until it had already happened. The animal went down sideways in water gone the color of old iron, and Levi went under with it, the cold hitting him like a physical blow to the chest that emptied his lungs before he had a chance to brace for it. Clara was already moving before anyone else on the bank had finished shouting. She tied a length of rope around her own waist, looped the other end twice around a cottonwood trunk thick enough to hold, and waded into water that came up past her hips, then her ribs, moving against a current that had already dragged two grown men off their feet, trying to reach the same spot. She reached Levi where the current had pinned him against a fallen branch, got one arm locked under his shoulders, and pulled him back toward the bank hand over hand along the rope, fighting the water the whole way with the same unhurried, refusing to be argued with strength she'd brought to every failing beam and collapsing shed since the day she arrived. They came up onto the bank together, both of them soaked through and shaking, and every man who had once stood outside the church laughing at the size of her stood on that bank now in absolute silence, watching her drag Levi Boone out of a current that would have killed him otherwise. Tom Halvorson was one of them. He had laughed loudest that first day outside the church, loud enough that Levi still remembered the particular sound of it. He said nothing at all for a long moment, watching Clara wring water from her sleeves like the whole ordeal had cost her no more than a hard day's work. Then he took his hat off, slow, and held it against his chest. "I don't expect I'll be laughing at anything about you again," he said, quiet, mostly to himself, though Clara heard it plain enough. Nobody laughed. Nobody would laugh again, not about this, not for a long while after. The sheriff came to the house himself 2 days later, hat in his hands, and did not sit down when Clara offered him a chair. "I've been carrying something I shouldn't have carried this long," he said. "Doyle leaned on me hard, month after month, to look the other way on things I had no business looking away from. Told myself it wasn't my fight. Watching you pull that man out of the creek with your own 2 hands made me ashamed of every excuse I'd been telling myself since Christmas." He held out a small brass key. "There's a box in the courthouse basement," he said, "filed under a name that isn't Doyle's, but ought to be. I think it's time somebody besides him took a look inside it." The box, when they opened it 2 days later in front of the circuit judge himself, held original survey records dated a full decade back, records that showed plainly what Levi's father's note had only hinted at. The gravel deposit under the North Ridge had been surveyed, assessed, and valued years before Levi's father ever took out his loan, and the mineral rights his father had refused 3 times to sell had been quietly forged onto later copies of the same documents, copies Silas Doyle had been using ever since to justify every foreclosure notice, every suspiciously generous extension, every pressure applied to a grieving widower too tired to look too closely at papers he had no reason yet to distrust. The forgery was plain enough, once a person knew to look for it, that the judge did not need more than an afternoon to see the shape of the whole scheme. Doyle's bank was placed under territorial oversight within the week. The sheriff, to his credit, testified against him without being asked twice. Months later, once the fraud had been fully unwound and the foreclosure papers formally torn up in front of witnesses, Mrs. Aldous finished the wedding dress she should have made the first time. Clara tried it on standing in front of the dressmaker's narrow mirror and looked at her own reflection a long while without speaking. Not because the dress had made her smaller, or because it had reshaped her into something the valley might find easier to look at. It fit because, for the first time in longer than she could measure, someone had built something specifically to hold the size she actually was, rather than asking her to fold herself down to fit what already existed. "It's not wrong on you," Mrs. Aldous said quietly, watching her. "It never should have been wrong on you the first time." "No," Clara agreed. "It shouldn't have." On the morning of the wedding, Levi found her outside before dawn, kneeling by the reinforced foundation stones beneath the house, one bare hand pressed flat against the cold rock the way she had that very first day. "What are you doing?" he asked her, "on a morning like this one?" "Making sure it's still holding," Clara said. He looked past her at the house behind them, sturdy now in a way it had not been in a decade, and at the barns rebuilt stronger than they'd started, and at the families already beginning to arrive down the lane, children running ahead of their parents' wagons, all of them coming to a home that had sheltered them once already when their own had failed. "I thought you rebuilt a homestead," Levi said. Clara looked up at him. "Turns out you rebuilt me too," he said. "The part of me that thought I was the Boone who finally let this place come apart. You never once let me believe that." Not even the mornings I was half convinced of it myself. He paused. You didn't just keep a roof from falling in, Clara. You rebuilt every last one of us who happened to be standing under it when you got here. She did not answer that in words. She did not need to. She rose, brushed the frost from her knees, and took the hand he offered, and together they walked back toward the house that had once nearly fallen in a blizzard with only her standing between it and collapse. The story began with a woman alone on a roof ridge in the dark, hammering against a storm that had already decided the house beneath her would not survive the night. It ends instead with that same roof standing over a kitchen full of neighbors, children underfoot, laughter carrying out into a yard where snow now falls soft and ordinary rather than sideways and cruel. The chipped tin cup still sits on the windowsill above the stove, dented and worn, exactly where it has sat every morning since the first one either of them can properly remember. The house is still standing. It was always going to be, once somebody finally trusted the hands that built it. But by the end, the valley understood something it had been too slow and too unkind to understand at the start. The house was never truly the thing worth saving. It was only ever the shape that let everyone finally see what Clara Whitlock had been the whole time, long before anyone thought to look at her plainly. The strongest structure on that ranch was never made of timber or stone or nails driven true against a blizzard wind. It was the woman the whole valley once believed was too large to belong anywhere at all, and who turned out, in the end, to be the only reason any of it was left standing when the storm finally passed.